Picture this. It's 1968, and America is coming apart at the seams. Students are getting beaten bloody on the Berkeley campus, cities are burning, and somewhere in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, a man named Jake Morrison is making perhaps the most important decision of his life. He's walking away from everything. His job with the Army Corps of Engineers, his comfortable salary, his place in what we might call civilized society, carrying nothing but what fits in his grandfather's old canvas pack. Now, you have to understand what this meant in 1968. This wasn't some romantic gap-year adventure that college kids take today. Jake Morrison was a trained engineer, a man who built bridges and dams, who understood how to move mountains, literally. But watching those protests on television, seeing his own government turn fire hoses and batons on American students, something broke inside him. Or maybe something finally clicked into place. His Cherokee grandmother had filled his childhood with stories. Stories about listening to the land, about places where the old spirits still walked, about mountains that remembered everything. Growing up, Jake had filed these tales away as beautiful folklore, the kind of wisdom that sounded profound around a campfire, but had no place in the world of concrete and steel girders. But in 1968, with the smell of tear gas drifting across American cities and the sound of helicopters becoming the soundtrack of the evening news, those ancient stories began to sound less like folklore and more like instructions for survival. So Jake packed that grandfather's pack, and think about this for a moment. Everything he thought he'd need for the rest of his life had to fit in one canvas bag. No credit cards, no bank accounts, no phone numbers to call when things got tough. Just whatever tools and supplies a man could carry on his back into the wilderness. Through spring rain that turned mountain trails into streams of mud, through summer drought that cracked the earth like broken pottery, Jake pushed deeper into the Colorado Rockies, following game trails that deer and elk had worn into the landscape over thousands of years. For 46 days, he walked. 46 days of learning what his body could endure when stripped of every modern convenience. 46 days of rediscovering skills his ancestors had known by instinct. How to read weather in the shape of clouds. How to find water by watching where birds flew at dawn. How to sleep warm when the mountain air could freeze a man's breath in his lungs. His engineer's mind mapped every ridge and valley, but something deeper was awakening in him with each step away from the world he'd left behind. Then came day 47, and everything changed. Picture the scene. Jake's moving through a narrow canyon, the kind of place where the walls rise so steep and close that noon feels like twilight. Storm clouds are building overhead, not the gentle rain clouds of lower elevations, but those massive, angry thunderheads that turn Rocky Mountain afternoons into battles between heaven and earth. The air itself feels electric, charged with the kind of energy that makes every hair on your body stand up and every instinct scream for shelter. That's when he saw her, a massive grizzly sow, and when I say massive, I mean the kind of bear that makes you understand why our ancestors built their entire mythologies around these creatures. She had cubs with her, 2 little ones, maybe 6 months old, still learning how the world worked. And Jake Morrison, 47 days into his journey back to something his grandmother had called the old ways, suddenly found himself in the most dangerous situation the American wilderness can offer, between a mother grizzly and anything she perceived as a threat to her babies. Now, here's what you need to understand about grizzly bears. They're not just big, they're impossibly fast, impossibly strong, and when they're protecting cubs, they become forces of nature that can turn a grown man into scattered pieces in seconds. Jake had 2 choices: run and probably die, or climb and maybe live. The cliff face behind him rose like a stone wall, wet from the approaching storm, offering handholds that looked more like suggestions than actual grips. He climbed, with lightning beginning to split the sky above him and 800 pounds of furious mother bear below him. Jake Morrison pulled himself up that cliff face, one desperate handhold at a time. His fingers, already torn and bleeding from weeks of living rough, searched frantically for anything solid in the wet stone. The bear was pacing below, occasionally standing on her hind legs, all 9 feet of her, testing whether she could follow him up. Thunder crashed across the canyon like the sound of worlds ending, and in that moment, pressed against cold stone with nowhere left to climb, Jake felt something give way beneath his fingers. Not his grip, the mountain itself. What he'd thought was solid rock cracked open, revealing a crevice just wide enough for a desperate man to squeeze through. He tumbled backward into absolute darkness, his grandfather's pack cushioning a fall that should have broken bones. When his headlamp finally cut through the black, Jake Morrison found himself staring at something that changed everything he thought he knew about this mountain, about the land, about the very nature of human history in these peaks. Spiral petroglyphs covered the walls around him, not random scratches or natural formations, but deliberate, complex patterns that seemed to move and flow in his flickering light. These weren't just pictures, they were messages, instructions, stories carved into living rock by people who had walked these mountains when Jake's own ancestors were still figuring out how to cross the Atlantic Ocean. The cave system opened before him like chapters in a book written in stone and shadow. Chamber after chamber revealed themselves, each one carefully constructed, each one holding secrets that the Fremont people had left behind 800 years ago. Stone benches circled fire pits that still held ancient ash. Think about that for a moment. Ash from fires that burned when Europe was just emerging from the Dark Ages, preserved in this mountain sanctuary like museum pieces. Obsidian arrowheads lay scattered beside ceramic vessels, painted with astronomical symbols that Jake's engineering mind recognized as sophisticated mathematical calculations. These weren't primitive people scratching out a bare existence in the wilderness. These were astronomers, engineers, architects who had built something magnificent and then disappeared. In the deepest chamber, Jake found their calendar stone, a wheel of carved seasons that matched his grandmother's stories perfectly, as if she'd been describing this exact artifact across generations of Cherokee oral tradition. Standing there in the darkness, surrounded by the work of people who had mastered this mountain centuries before Europeans even knew this continent existed, Jake Morrison realized he hadn't just found shelter from a storm, he'd found his destiny. But what he discovered next would change not just his own life, but the fate of every sacred place these ancient builders had left behind. So there's Jake Morrison, 47 days into what started as an escape from civilization, now standing in a chamber that civilization had forgotten existed. And here's where the story gets really interesting, because what Jake does next tells us everything about the kind of man he was becoming. Or maybe, the kind of man he'd always been but had never had the chance to discover. Most people, finding themselves in an 800-year-old archaeological treasure trove, would do one of two things. Either run back to town, screaming about their discovery, or start grabbing artifacts to sell on the black market. Jake Morrison did neither. Instead, he spent autumn learning from the dead. Think about that phrase for a moment, learning from the dead, because that's exactly what the Fremont people had left behind, a complete curriculum in how to live on this mountain. Not just survive, mind you, but actually thrive in one of the most challenging environments North America has to offer. These weren't desperate refugees hiding in caves. These were master engineers who had solved problems Jake's own profession was still struggling with in 1968. Take their grain storage systems. Jake found chambers where seeds had remained viable for centuries. Not decades. Centuries. In an age before plastic containers, before chemical preservatives, before any of the technology we take for granted, the Fremont had created storage that could keep food fresh longer than most modern refrigerators. Jake studied these systems like they were blueprints, measuring the air gaps, analyzing the clay seals, understanding how they'd controlled humidity and temperature using nothing but stone and human ingenuity. But it wasn't just the practical engineering that fascinated him. The Fremont had channeled mountain springs through their living spaces with a sophistication that would make modern hydrologists jealous. Water flowed exactly where they wanted it, when they wanted it, through channels carved so precisely that Jake's surveyor's eye could barely detect the gradients. They'd created comfort in an environment that should have been barely habitable, and they'd done it without disturbing the mountain's natural systems. The smoke holes were perhaps the most impressive feature. perfect ventilation that drew fresh air through the entire complex while venting cooking fires and human breath without creating drafts or losing precious heat. Jake spent days with his engineering notebooks, sketching airflow patterns, trying to understand principles that his profession had somehow forgotten in its rush toward mechanical solutions. But the real treasure, the discovery that changed everything, waited behind a hidden panel in what Jake was beginning to understand had been the spiritual heart of the complex. Picture this scene. Jake's been living in these chambers for weeks now, learning to read the Fremont pictographs like instruction manuals. He's figured out their plant medicine symbols, their animal behavior charts, their seasonal preparation guides. But there's one wall that doesn't make sense, covered in spirals that seem more complex, more deliberate than anything else he's found. His grandmother had always said that important things were hidden in plain sight, protected by people's tendency to look for the obvious rather than the meaningful. So Jake starts running his hands over these spirals, feeling for irregularities. And there it is, a section of stone that moves just slightly under pressure. The panel slides away to reveal a sealed chamber, untouched by time or moisture, where the tribe's sacred bundle waited in perfect preservation. Ceremonial masks carved from wood that should have rotted away centuries ago, prayer stones polished smooth by countless hands, and there, arranged in meditation posture as if he'd simply chosen to rest for a moment 800 years ago, sat the bones of what must have been their last shaman. Now, this is where Jake Morrison proved he was more than just a displaced engineer playing at being an archaeologist. He understood immediately that he was looking at something sacred, something that demanded respect rather than curiosity. The skeleton wore a necklace of bear claws and eagle talons, power symbols that Jake's Cherokee heritage helped him recognize. But it was the crystal at the center of the necklace that stopped him cold. This wasn't just any stone. In the absolute darkness of the sealed chamber, it caught and reflected his headlamp beam in ways that seemed to defy physics. Light bounced inside it, creating patterns that matched the spiral petroglyphs, as if the crystal itself was a three-dimensional version of the messages carved into the walls. Jake spent 3 days fasting before he touched anything in that chamber. 3 days sitting just outside the entrance, living on water and contemplation, preparing himself for whatever responsibility he was about to accept. Because that's what this was, not a discovery, but an inheritance. The Fremont hadn't left these things behind accidentally. They'd left them for someone who would understand their true value. When he finally entered the chamber, Jake handled each item like the sacred artifact it was. He rewrapped the masks in cloth that crumbled at his touch, replacing it with material from his own pack. He arranged the prayer stones according to patterns his grandmother had whispered during his childhood, stories he'd thought were just bedtime tales, but now recognized as actual instructions passed down through generations of indigenous knowledge. Winter forced Jake to put all this ancient wisdom to the test. And let me tell you, Rocky Mountain winter doesn't care how inspired you are by 800-year-old engineering. When the snow starts falling and the temperature drops to 20 below zero, you either know how to survive, or you become another cautionary tale about city folks who thought they could conquer the wilderness. But Jake had the best teachers imaginable, techniques that had kept the Fremont alive and comfortable through winters that would have killed modern backpackers. Their method of banking coals in sand allowed him to maintain fire for days with minimal fuel. Their weather reading system, cloud formations, wind patterns, animal behavior, gave him advance warning of storms that would have caught him unprepared. The cache pits were perhaps the most crucial discovery. The Fremont had developed a way of storing meat that kept it frozen but accessible, buried at precise depths that maintained perfect temperatures without risking spoilage. Jake learned to read the landscape like a freezer map, understanding which slopes held cold, which valleys trapped warm air, how to use the mountain's own geology as a preservation system. By spring, something remarkable had happened. The valley hunters, men who'd spent their entire lives in these mountains, began noticing changes. Smoke patterns that didn't match any known camping techniques, drum sounds that echoed from ridges where no one should have been able to climb, and strangest of all, tracks of a figure who moved through forests like mist, appearing and disappearing without disturbing the natural patterns of wildlife. Local rancher Tom Whitehorse, descended from Ute people who had known these mountains before white settlers arrived, finally decided to investigate. Tom was the kind of man who could track a deer across solid rock, who could read the history of a season in the growth patterns of grass. When he climbed up to find the source of these strange stories, he discovered Jake building with techniques his own grandfather had described but never seen practiced. The two men shared a meal in silence, not the uncomfortable silence of strangers, but the respectful quiet of people who understood that some communications happened without words. Finally, Tom spoke, words that would change the trajectory of everything that followed. "My people have been waiting for someone to properly care for this place." Tom became Jake's first ally, bringing supplies and news from the valley in exchange for Jake's promise to protect what shouldn't be disturbed. But more than that, Tom brought validation, confirmation that Jake wasn't just some crazy white man playing Indian in the mountains, but someone who had genuinely connected with traditions that bridged tribal boundaries. Through that alliance, Jake began to understand the true scope of what he'd discovered. The ruins weren't just Fremont. They were a gathering place where multiple tribes had come for ceremonies, for trade, for the kind of spiritual practice that required absolute privacy from the outside world. And that's when Jake Morrison realized his real education was just beginning. Through the 1970s, Jake Morrison underwent a transformation that would have been impossible to predict when he first tumbled into those ancient chambers. He evolved from seeker to something far more complex, a guardian who stood between two worlds, protecting secrets that could reshape our understanding of pre-Columbian America, while keeping them safe from a civilization that had already proven it couldn't be trusted with such treasures. Think about what Jake was attempting here. In an era when every archaeological discovery became a tourist attraction, when sacred sites were turned into gift shops and parking lots, he was trying to maintain something that our modern world had forgotten how to value, the concept of places too important to exploit, and he was doing it alone, with nothing but his wits, his growing understanding of ancient techniques, and an alliance with Tom Whitehorse that was built on mutual respect rather than legal contracts. Jake built his homestead using Fremont foundation patterns, but calling it a homestead barely captures what he was actually creating. From the outside, it looked like the simple cabin of a mountain hermit, rough-hewn logs, a stone chimney, the kind of structure that wouldn't have looked out of place in 1870. But Jake's engineering background, combined with his study of Fremont defensive positions, had produced something far more sophisticated than it appeared. The cabin connected to the cave chambers through concealed passages that Jake had carved using techniques learned from studying Fremont tunneling methods. What visitors saw was a primitive shelter. What Jake had actually built was a fortress disguised as rustic simplicity. Hidden defensive positions allowed him to observe anyone approaching long before they could see him. Emergency exits provided escape routes that led to predetermined rally points throughout the mountain complex. But Jake's real genius lay in understanding that the best defense wasn't military, it was psychological. He made himself appear to be exactly what people expected. A burnt-out veteran who'd gone native in the mountains, harmless and slightly crazy. The kind of character that made for good local color, but posed no real threat to anyone's plans. The first test of this strategy came in 1974, when government surveyors arrived searching for mineral deposits. Now, you have to understand the context here. This was the era of the energy crisis, when America was desperately searching for domestic resources to reduce dependence on foreign oil. Teams of geologists were scouring the Rockies for anything valuable: oil, natural gas, coal, uranium, rare earth minerals. And Jake's Mountain, with its complex geology and remote location, looked like exactly the kind of place that might be hiding something profitable. Jake met them with coffee and misdirection that would have impressed a professional magician. His maps showed nothing but barren rock where the ruins lay hidden. When they asked about cave systems, he mentioned a few, obvious ones, while carefully omitting any reference to the Fremont complex. His performance was perfect, helpful enough to avoid suspicion, knowledgeable enough to seem credible, but just confused enough about specific locations to make them lose interest in detailed surveying. When polite misdirection wasn't enough, Jake activated defenses the Fremont had built into the mountain itself. Rock slides blocked survey paths, but these weren't random geological events. Jake had learned to reset ancient deadfall systems, stone arrangements that looked natural but could be triggered to create exactly the kind of obstacles that would convince surveyors the area was too unstable for development. The beauty of these systems was their subtlety. Modern engineers, looking at blocked paths and unstable slopes, saw geological hazards. They never suspected human intervention, especially not human intervention designed by people who had vanished centuries before Europeans reached the New World. Jake was fighting 20th-century invasions with 8th-century technology, and it was working perfectly. But the real challenge came in 1976, when developer Marcus Crown arrived with plans that would have turned Jake's sacred mountain into another ski resort. Crown wasn't some small-time local operator looking to make a quick profit. This was serious money, backed by investors who had already transformed half of Colorado's high country into playgrounds for wealthy tourists. Crown brought armed security, legal teams, and political connections that reached all the way to the state capitol. He had survey crews, environmental impact specialists, and marketing teams that were already designing brochures for Mystic Mountain Resort, where ancient spirits meet modern luxury. The irony would have been hilarious if it wasn't so terrifying. Jake's network of locals sabotaged equipment with the kind of precision that suggested military training. Bulldozers developed mysterious mechanical problems. Survey stakes disappeared overnight. Radio communications suffered from interference that technical experts couldn't explain. But these were just delaying tactics, harassment designed to increase Crown's costs while Jake prepared his real counterattack. That counterattack revealed just how much Jake Morrison had changed from the disillusioned engineer who'd walked into the mountains 8 years earlier. Somehow, and witnesses swore they checked the security tapes afterward, Jake appeared in Crown's Denver office, 30 floors above street level, having bypassed electronic locks, motion sensors, and armed guards without triggering a single alarm. Crown found ancient arrowheads arranged on his desk in patterns that matched the spiral petroglyphs, accompanied by a note written in Jake's careful engineer's handwriting. The mountain protects itself. No threats, no demands, just a simple statement that Crown's security team spent weeks trying to understand, while Crown himself began having nightmares about figures in ceremonial masks watching him from the shadows of his penthouse apartment. The psychological warfare was devastatingly effective. Crown's investors began pulling out, citing irregularities in the environmental surveys and concerns about project viability. Local permits became mysteriously difficult to obtain. Construction crews developed a strange reluctance to work on the project, reporting an unusual number of equipment malfunctions and unexplained accidents. But Jake's greatest work during this period wasn't defensive, it was educational. Young people began finding their way up hidden trails, drawn by stories that spread through the counterculture networks of the 70s like underground gospel. They came seeking something their generation had lost in the chaos of Vietnam and Watergate, connection to something larger than politics and profit. Sarah Wyndham was perhaps the most important of these seekers. A graduate student in archaeology who had become disillusioned with academic approaches that treated indigenous cultures like museum specimens, Sarah arrived at Jake's Mountain carrying questions that formal education couldn't answer. What she found was a teacher who could bridge the gap between scholarly knowledge and lived wisdom. Jake taught her the Fremont astronomical observations, not just the mathematical calculations, but the practical applications that had allowed ancient people to predict weather patterns months in advance. Their water purification methods that used nothing but sand, charcoal, and gravity to create drinking water cleaner than anything coming out of city treatment plants. Their way of reading seasons in bark patterns, animal behavior, and subtle changes in plant growth that modern science was only beginning to understand. Together, they documented everything while keeping locations absolutely secret. Jake's 43 journals grew into a comprehensive record of Fremont technology, spiritual practices, and environmental management techniques. But unlike academic research that sought to publish and share knowledge, Jake and Sarah were creating a knowledge base designed to survive without exposing the sacred sites to exploitation. They developed a system of coded references that would allow future guardians to locate and understand the ruins without providing enough information for treasure hunters or developers to follow the same trail. Maps that looked like nature sketches, technical specifications disguised as poetry, astronomical data hidden in what appeared to be personal diary entries about weather and wildlife. By the end of the decade, Jake had achieved something that should have been impossible in modern America. The ruins remained completely untouched, unknown to archaeology departments, government agencies, or commercial interests. The area had been classified by official surveys as worthless, too unstable for development, too barren for agriculture, too remote for tourism infrastructure. Meanwhile, locals protected boundaries they didn't fully understand but deeply respected. Tom Whitehorse had spread word through tribal networks that something important was being preserved on the mountain, something that connected to traditions older than any single tribe's memory. Ranch families began routing their cattle around certain areas without being asked. Hunters avoided specific ridges without quite knowing why. Even Tom Whitehorse, who knew Jake better than anyone, admitted that his friend had become something more than a guardian. "He's learned to think like the mountain itself," Tom told Sarah during one of their rare conversations about Jake's transformation. "Sometimes I watch him move through the forest, and I swear he's not quite walking on the ground. It's like the land is carrying him where he needs to go." But this perfect balance between preservation and secrecy was about to face its greatest test. Climate change was already beginning to affect the Rocky Mountain ecosystem in ways that 1970s science was just starting to understand. Drought cycles were becoming more severe, fire seasons were extending longer, and the delicate environmental conditions that had preserved the Fremont ruins for 8 centuries were starting to shift. Jake could feel it in his bones, the way his grandmother had always said she could feel weather changes before they appeared in the sky. The mountain was preparing for something catastrophic, and all of Jake's careful planning was about to be tested by forces beyond any human control. The summer of 1987 brought the worst drought in Rocky Mountain memory, and Jake Morrison, now silver-haired and lean as rawhide after 20 years of mountain living, felt the forest's distress in his very bones. This wasn't just weather. This was the kind of ecological crisis that reshapes entire landscapes, the sort of catastrophe that turns thriving ecosystems into moonscapes overnight. Jake had spent 2 decades absorbing the land's rhythms like some kind of human seismograph, learning to read the mountain's moods in ways that would have seemed impossible to the engineer who'd first stumbled into those ancient chambers. Every sign pointed toward disaster. The pine needles were turning brown in July instead of October. Springs that had run continuously for centuries were drying to trickles. Even the wildlife was behaving strangely. Deer abandoning traditional watering holes, birds changing migration patterns, predators moving to lower elevations in search of prey that was fleeing the dying high country. Working with Sarah Wyndham and a handful of locals who'd earned the mountain's trust over the years, Jake activated fire preparation plans that he'd been developing since the mid-70s. But these weren't the standard fire breaks that Forest Service crews would have cut, straight lines, bulldozed through timber with all the subtlety of military engineering. Jake's preparations followed Fremont burn patterns, ancient fire management techniques that worked with natural fuel loads and wind patterns instead of fighting against them. The Fremont had understood something that modern fire science was only beginning to rediscover. Controlled burning wasn't just about preventing catastrophic fires, it was about maintaining the health of entire ecosystems. Their fire breaks followed ridge lines and natural clearings in patterns that looked random to casual observers, but revealed sophisticated understanding of how fire moves through mountainous terrain. Jake and his team cached water in strategic locations using Fremont storage techniques, not just surface pools that would evaporate in the heat, but underground reserves that stayed cool and accessible even during the worst drought conditions. They moved the most sacred artifacts deeper into the cave system, beyond chambers, that Jake had never shown to anyone, into spaces that the Fremont had designed as ultimate refuges against disasters that could last for years. When lightning finally struck dried pine on August 3rd, the explosion of flame across the ridgelines moved faster than anyone had predicted. Faster, perhaps, than anyone except Jake Morrison had prepared for. Forest Service crews, equipped with helicopters and bulldozers and all the technology of modern firefighting, took one look at the wall of fire sweeping down those slopes and declared the mountain lost. But Jake activated plans that had been 20 years in the making. Picture this scene. A fire moving through forest at speeds that defy comprehension, creating its own weather systems, generating winds that can uproot trees and launch burning debris for miles. Temperatures hot enough to melt aluminum, smoke columns visible from space, and somewhere in the middle of this inferno, Jake Morrison and his network implementing strategies that predated the founding of America by centuries. His people, and by this point that's what they were, people who'd given their loyalty to something larger than any individual agenda, lit backfires following those ancient fireways. Not random attempts to slow the flames, but precisely timed ignitions that channeled the main fire around critical areas like water being diverted by carefully placed stones. The backfires followed Fremont routes so perfectly that it seemed impossible Jake could have planned them without some kind of supernatural guidance. Flames that should have consumed everything in their path found themselves flowing around pockets of forest that the ancient inhabitants had marked as essential for the mountain's long-term survival. Medicinal plant groves that had grown undisturbed for centuries remained untouched, while fire raged on all sides. Witnesses, and there were witnesses, because Forest Service helicopters circled constantly, documenting what they assumed would be total destruction, swore they saw Jake walk through walls of flame completely untouched, not running, not dodging, but walking calmly through fire that should have killed him instantly, guided by figures in ceremonial masks that appeared and disappeared in the smoke like heat mirages. Now, you can dismiss these accounts as hallucinations caused by smoke inhalation and stress. You can explain them as tricks of light and shadow that made ordinary people seem supernatural, but the results speak for themselves. When the fire finally burned itself out after 2 weeks of destruction that consumed hundreds of thousands of acres across 3 counties, Jake's mountain stood like an island of green in an ocean of ash. The fire's aftermath revealed Jake's deepest secret and created his greatest crisis. Where flames had cleared decades of undergrowth, more ruins appeared. Not just scattered artifacts or single chambers, but an entire Fremont city built into mountainside, terraces. Structures that archaeologists had dreamed of finding, preservation that museums would have killed for, evidence that could rewrite textbooks about pre-Columbian civilization in North America. Government helicopters circled like vultures, while archaeologists from major universities demanded immediate access. Television crews arrived from Denver and Salt Lake City, broadcasting images of ruins that looked like something from National Geographic specials about lost civilizations. Federal agencies began drawing up plans for archaeological preserves that would have turned Jake's sacred mountain into another Mesa Verde, complete with visitor centers, guided tours, and gift shops selling plastic replicas of Fremont pottery. But Jake Morrison had spent 20 years preparing for exactly this moment. Working with Tom Whitehorse's tribal council and environmental lawyers that Sarah had been cultivating for years, they established the site as a joint archaeological preserve, an indigenous sacred space. Not a national monument that would attract millions of tourists, but a restricted area with access controlled by a committee that Jake had spent decades building through patient relationship building and careful political maneuvering. The legal framework was brilliant in its simplicity. Multiple tribal nations claimed historical connection to the area, creating a web of indigenous rights that federal agencies couldn't simply override. Environmental groups documented species that required absolute protection from human disturbance. Academic institutions were granted limited research access, under conditions that prevented publication of specific locations or detailed site maps. Jake had created a protection system that satisfied everyone's legal requirements while ensuring that the ruins would remain essentially inaccessible to anyone who couldn't prove legitimate scholarly purpose and cultural sensitivity. The mountain would be preserved, but it would never become a tourist destination. On winter solstice that year, Jake led what would be his final ceremony in the ruins. The participants included Sarah, Tom, and 12 others who had earned the mountain's trust through years of service and absolute discretion. They gathered in the main chamber where Jake had first discovered the calendar stone, now lit by candles arranged in patterns that matched Fremont astronomical observations. Jake placed his 43 volumes of journals, 20 years of observations, discoveries, and growing understanding, in the shaman's chamber alongside new offerings contributed by each member of the group. Sacred items from Cherokee, Ute, and Fremont traditions, creating a collection that honored all the peoples who had found spiritual significance in this place. The ceremony lasted until dawn, with Jake speaking words in languages that some participants recognized and others felt in their bones without understanding intellectually. As the sun rose over the fire-scarred landscape, painting the preserved forest in golden light that seemed to emanate from the mountain itself, Jake Morrison walked deeper into the cave system than anyone had ever ventured. He never emerged. Search teams found only his pack at the entrance to a passage that geological surveys insisted led nowhere, a dead end that couldn't possibly connect to any other part of the cave system. But Jake's tracks led directly into solid stone, as if the mountain had simply opened to receive him and then sealed itself behind his passage. The official report listed Jake Morrison as missing and presumed dead, another casualty of mountain living who had finally pushed his luck too far. But locals know better. On quiet nights, drums still echo from chambers that remain sealed to human entry. The calendar stone somehow stays free of dust, as if invisible hands maintain what Jake Morrison spent 20 years protecting. Sarah Wyndham became the official guardian of Jake's legacy, managing the restricted access programs and ensuring that research proceeded according to principles Jake had established. Tom Whitehorse's tribal council maintains spiritual oversight of the ceremonial aspects of the site. Together, they preserve something that Jake Morrison understood from his very first day in those ancient chambers. Some discoveries are too important to share carelessly. Some knowledge requires guardians who understand that protection is more valuable than publicity. Jake Morrison found his way home by walking away from everything modern civilization offered and everything it demanded in return. In the end, he became what the Fremont people had always intended their mountain sanctuary to create, a bridge between worlds that preserves the past while guiding the future, a reminder that some things matter more than progress, and some places are too sacred to exploit. The mountain keeps its secrets still, protected by legal frameworks that Jake built as carefully as any Fremont engineering project, watched over by people who understand that the greatest discoveries are often the ones we choose not to share with a world that has forgotten how to value what cannot be sold.